Greetings, and welcome to Beatles Stuffology, where two old friends sit about and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis pretty much for the sake of it. My name is JG McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello.
Are you ready for one of the big totemic singles that we're going to have to cover?
I mean, it's the biggest, isn't it? I mean, it's the biggest selling Beatles single of all time. So, you know, it's the biggest in terms of sales, but it's also the biggest, you could argue, in terms of sheer cultural impact. You know, it changed the world or something like that, you know.
Well, here's an obvious place to start then. Does it deserve that reputation?
Yes. You were expecting more, though. It does, and then again, it doesn't. Now, whilst I pull that splinter out of my backside, I think it's worth saying that it is, I think, the point at which the Beatles explode, not just culturally, but in terms of how performance and production really starts to go above and beyond. Because my point of view, I think Please Please Me is the better song, but I think She Loves You as a single is the better performance and has the better, more explosive production. And I think maybe we'll sort of come on to that as we go through the episode. What do you think of it?
I think it's a great song. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's full of vim and vigor and pep and energy. It's got just a huge amount of kind of life captured in just a couple of minutes. It's an extraordinary recording, and often when we do this, it's nice if we can find a bit of an alternative take, or if we can look at some of the songs that we're covering in a different light or a different view or whatever. But when it comes to a song like this, there's not really a lot that I can add which is going to be particularly out with the sort of expectations of what you're going to say about a song like this. It's a phenomenal song. It's a great performance. It's not complicated. It's not anything else, but it kind of does deserve its reputation. Whether it deserves its reputation as the biggest seller. You could dispute that, I suppose, if you wanted to. But I mean, if you're going to take, particularly from the Beatles' early career, any song which kind of deserves those sales figures, then it's hard to argue it shouldn't maybe be this one. It is a phenomenal recording, and I do think it takes all the lessons which have been learned from Please Please Me, the album. It throws them all together. It combines them in a way which I don't think any of it is necessarily unique, but it's all just done in a way that just hasn't been done in quite this way, and just hasn't been done as well as it's done here. So yeah, I mean, it's a terrific piece of work. I have no hot takes to offer this week, I'm afraid.
So I mean, let's start with something, I suppose, contextual. By the time it enters the charts in late August of '63, From Me to You has been hanging around for 20 weeks. So it's actually, for the Beatles' career up to this point, it's quite a big gap in terms of releasing something new. And in that time, the charts have changed from early '63. There are a lot more of those perhaps sort of seminal '60s or early '60s groups in there. So it's quite interesting. I mean, we've even got some surf music in there. Surfing USA, for example, has been in the charts for 5 weeks, hovering around the mid to low 30s, not really doing anything, on its way down. The Hollies are sort of creeping out of the charts, but Searchin's been in it for something like 40 odd weeks. And I gather that that's also a song that crops up on Anthology. It may even have been one of the Decca recordings. And that's fine. That's sort of a little bit bluesy, but you are getting more of those acts. So towards the top of the charts, we've got Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas at number 1, Freddie and the Dreamers, the Searchers' Sweet for My Sweet, which would be like a Tony Blackburn Radio 2 staple these days. We've got the Safaris and Wipeout, Billy Fury. There's a lot going on there that we would sort of say is recognisably early 60s, of that new breed of pop music away from the Elvises and Cliff Richard, who were also in the charts, of course. So it's interesting that there seems to be a little bit of a shake-up, possibly off the back of it may well have happened anyway, that those bands would have come in because they were around, alongside the Beatles. I think it's too coincidental to say that they were inspired by the Beatles, but they've certainly been going through the hole that's been created for them by things like From Me to You and Please Please Me. So there's a difference in public reception. And it surprises me as well that She Loves You only goes in at number 12. Just seems a little bit surprising. It is the highest new entry, and I suppose this is still in a time before songs going straight in at number 1 were much more common. That comes a little bit later in the Beatles' career, and then tails off until you get Slade doing it, and then it tails off, and it's the Jam, or the next big band that do it, and obviously it's a lot more common now. But considering how big She Loves You becomes in terms of sales, I was just a little surprised to see, number 12. Okay, fair enough. And it doesn't even go up to number 1 the next week. I think it then sort of hits the top 5.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those songs where you can get a sense of momentum building behind it, but it also spends 33 weeks in the charts. So, you don't necessarily have to be, at number 1 for all of that for the sales figures to accumulate. And that's the thing. Even although it takes a bit of time to build itself up to number 1 and it stays there for a considerable length of time, it hangs around for, more than half a year in the charts, which is... astonishing. I mean, no wonder it's the biggest selling Beatles single of all time. Yeah. It's really remarkable. One thing it's also worth mentioning, you're talking about sort of the bands which have kind of broken through there. A lot of the kind of Mersey beat bands, a lot of those kind of groups starting making their impact in the charts. The 4th week that She Loves You is sitting at number 1. The Rolling Stones are at number 21 with their first single, so that door is about to be kicked open as well. So it's also not only has have the doors been open for those kind of genre bands who are I've been disparaging about Mersey beat bands on previous episodes and will continue to be so future episodes. But it's undoubtedly it becomes a movement. But out with that kind of movement as well, you also have these other acts who are now going to start to make their presence felt, and the Stones is kind of the first significant one, which isn't just part of that kind of genre extension of what the Beatles have been doing up until now.
I think there's also still that traditional element that's in the charts, and it's worth pointing out that Ken Dodd has entered the chart at I think number 50, but also Wink Martindale, Deck of Cards, a song that I know from my dad's record collection, listening to his Max Boyce records. He did a jokey version of Deck of Cards. That's been in the charts for 28 weeks.
Wow.
So there are still some of those, old-fashioned things that are in there that presumably the parents are buying. So, there's not a complete change, but you are starting to see some absolute changes occurring. And maybe that's where we're sort of getting those cultures clashing against each other. Interesting to think how perhaps whether or not people who were buying Elvis records were also buying Beatles records. The same with Cliff Richard. Were people buying both? Or were they switching from one to another? Much as in the same way as, in the early 80s, you probably were a Duran Duran fan or a Spandau Ballet fan. You couldn't really be both.
No, that's fair enough. And one other thing I think is worth noting about the charts as well is Brian Poole and the Tremolos are in the charts with Twist and Shout. They being the band that Decca selected over the Beatles. After their kind of infamous rejection there. And it's just interesting to see them indeed signed to Decca. Hovering around, the middle, the upper middle reaches of the charts with a song, that the Beatles have already quite effortlessly conquered.
Yeah. It's a strange time, but it must have been a really exciting time for young people hearing the kind of music that they wanted to hear. To actually then see it being successful. And then it's sort of quite interesting to think that actually the opportunities to hear it on the radio were still relatively limited. We're only just starting to get more of an explosion in programming for young people. And actually it's worth pointing out that of course then what we start to get is more television programming that's aimed at young people. And you can see why the Beatles would have been successful in some ways, because they're very non-threatening in terms of their appearance. So there is a performance that that YouTube threw up for me in its algorithms when I was sort of doing a bit of research, and it's one of those in which they're wearing those collarless suits, those horrible collarless suits, but they're in suits, they're in matching suits, and they're still taking the traditional bow at the end of the song. But it is worth noting from that, and this is where I enter into the realm of an observation about Ringo, that in that version, he thumps those drums so loud. They're so much more obvious than they are on the single version, where they're not as predominant. So it's fascinating. Obviously, you've just got the four of them playing in a TV studio, live audience. He is having the time of his life, just hitting those drums as hard as he possibly can. And yes, folks, listeners at home, you can imagine, I am making some very strong hand gestures at that point to emphasise exactly what I'm saying.
Fantastic, and I'm witness to those, so I can confirm he speaketh the truth. No, I mean absolutely, but I mean also I think one of the things about what you're saying there is sort of brushing up something that we haven't much touched on when we've been talking about this podcast, which is Brian Epstein and his influence across the band. And both those things, those awful Pierre Cardin colourless suits and taking a bow, those are both things that he instigated within the band. And you're right, they look incredibly kind of traditional and old-fashioned by today's standards. It's just not something... It's not something that's going to last, but it's a very clear, very distinct kind of influence, physical, visual influence that Brian Epstein had over the way the band were kind of trying to put themselves across. And you mentioned sort of TV and the influence of television. There was very little in terms of pop music on TV at this stage, and Jukebox Jury would have been the fundamental sort of program to try and capture the youth audience for the BBC. But we are just a few months away from the very first episodes of Top of the Pops, and that's going to have a fairly... Is revolutionary too strong a word? It's certainly going to have a huge kind of cultural impact in terms of the accessibility and in terms of kind of the visual presentation of the way that bands are going to put themselves across. And for all that Jukebox Jury is obviously, it's kind of a seminal music program. It's very, very important in the history of music being broadcast on television. I don't think it can hold a candle to the influence and importance of Top of the Pops. And yeah, we're just a few very short months away from that, and the first episode, which was broadcast on 1st of January 1964.
To which I will say, God bless the BBC and all who sail in her. Long may it stay a wonderful cultural institution. It has flaws, but it needs to stay. Right, politics out of the way. Right, okay, move on. You know what we haven't done yet? We haven't talked about the song. I mean,
that's quite.
It's typical for one of our conversations, and this is where actually it gets quite interesting, because the song itself is actually quite simple and straightforward, and it's surprising actually when you listen to it and you think, well, there's nothing really in it, in the song, in the writing, where you'd go, oh, okay, that stands out. I think it's all in the performance and it's in the production.
I mean, I'm very much inclined to agree, and I think the simplicity of the song is one of the things which allows it to have the kind of impact that it does. This is where I sort of very briefly have I'm going to mention some guitar chords now.
Ooh.
But, it's E minor, A seventh, and C. I mean, that's the bulk of the song, and then there's, a couple of other, thrown in there for good measure. But, the actual bones of the song itself are incredibly sort of simple. Anybody could really sort of write or play this song, but they didn't, and these two young gentlemen did. But it's amazing just how much space it gives for the impact, because it's such a simple thing. Everything is hammered. Like you mentioned Ringo hitting the drums there. And like that opening salvo that he fires at the beginning is just captivating. It's incredibly energetic, it's powerful, it's exactly what the song needs to kick it off. It is not in any way complicated or technically proficient or any of that kind of stuff, but it's precisely what the song needs. And that's what the song does throughout the entire length of its run. It doesn't necessarily go for the complexity, but in its simplicity, it's able to kind of have that power and energy sort of fire through behind it.
So it's worth pointing out that the B-side to From Me to You and the B-side to She Loves You both have melodies that kind of jump around quite a lot. There's a much greater range of those, and they don't really work. And yet there is a tradition of relatively simple, straightforward, almost one-chord songs being some of the best songs ever recorded, the best pop songs ever recorded. See also Pulp's Common People, for example, and others. Listener, you will have your own examples. But in terms of generational songs, sometimes you just need that simplicity to, as you say, allow the space for all the other things to kick in. So by saying it's a really simple song, actually we should remind our dear listener that it's a really simple but really bloody effective song.
Yeah, it really is. And we sort of brushed up about talking about the cultural legacy of the song, and there's all the usual kind of stuff about this kind of music being known as yeah music because of the yeahs and this and all that kind of stuff. But it's kind of easy to gloss over that sort of impact when actually talking about the song. But it's so powerful the way that those yes are delivered. If you listen to this song sort of straight off the bat, it's kind of not surprising that this one song came to kind of define and indeed name what was essentially an entire genre of music, and especially the split harmony on the final it has just a little thing like that makes all the difference in the world. It's not like soaring Everly Brothers harmonies or whatever, but just the way that the voices interlock on that final it just gives it that extra push that you wouldn't get from anyone else and didn't get from anyone else, and it makes all the difference in the world.
So we should then flag up that we're about to say one of the things that everybody knows about this, that of course they were asked by, was it McCartney's father or someone like that?
Yeah, it was Jim McCartney.
To yes, and you think, right, okay, well, that's where the kids understand the cultural impact better than the parents. There is that. I think the yeahs are really such an important part of this, because actually, if you listen to the first time it's yeah, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's quite something. But the chorus after the second verse, there's almost like an explosion when they sing yeah. But actually, it's the final She Loves You, yeah. At that point, you think, well, there's much more energy in what they're singing there than in Lennon's apparently fabled performance of Twist and Shout. There is just life and joy and energy, and pay attention to us. In that repeated phrase there, it's just so powerful, so important that they thought that this is their moment, and to have that sort of celebratory outpouring through an expression like yeah is phenomenal.
What's also really clear, I think, if you listen to other versions that the Beatles recorded, is how much attention they pay to this song. If you listen to the version which is on Anthology, if you listen to the version which is on Live at the BBC, any of the bootleg versions, any of the sort of American tour versions when they play this song, every single one is basically identical. They never ever fluff it. They're all, and even the length of time that the songs, especially if you play live, you always speed up, but they're pretty good at not speeding up that much on this one, whereas there are definitely other songs, Twist and Shout's a perfect example, where they just blast through it. It's done and dusted in no time at all. But everything in this song is pretty rock solid. It's pretty stable, and every single time they play it sounds like every other single time they say it, which on the one hand doesn't make for the most exciting exploration of live albums in the world ever, but on the other hand it does make me think of how much they are investing in this song, how much they understood the significance of it. If you take even Please Please Me, even I Saw Her Standing There, you get more variety when you listen to those live versions, but this one, every single time, it's knocked out of the park in the same way.
Which I suppose reinforces the point about it being a really simple but really effective song. There's much fewer moving parts, so you can perhaps emphasise the drumming, you can perhaps do something with the harmonies. But I tell you what's interesting for me, looking at a few recordings of it, it's the way in which Lennon and McCartney and Harrison deal with the harmonies on this. Because, of course, you don't really get a sense of it from listening to it. But then when you watch them perform it, you have, for the whole song, you've got Lennon and McCartney singing. But actually, it's surprising how many lines Harrison sings on. He seems to almost... So the first line, he stands back. Second line, he comes forward and it suddenly becomes a three-part harmony. Then he stands back. It's sort of interesting that they took that decision to really emphasise the vocals as a three-part harmony pretty much all the way through.
Well, and the three-part harmonies is one of the things, I mean, the harmonies in general is one of the things that really made the Beatles stand out, particularly from their kind of British contemporaries. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Everly Brothers, and that's clear influence in the way that Lennon and McCartney put their harmonies together. But in terms of other British groups at the time, they weren't really doing that. There's no big harmonies on like Cliff and the Shadows songs or anything like that. Cliff was pretty much the biggest recording artist in the UK at that sort of time, or at least prior to the release of anything by the Beatles. And that's true. If you look at the other kind of British bands, the Dakotas don't have that with Billy J. Kramer. Jerry and the Pacemakers aren't doing those kind of harmonies.
The Hollies,
it is something.
The Hollies do.
Hollies, yeah, that's true. But as a general rule, it was something which made them distinctive. It's something that made them stand out rather than something which was following the pack. So it makes sense that given they've got three people who are, vocally capable of delivering on those kind of harmonies. Sorry, Ringo, I love you. But three people who are capable of delivering on those harmonies, it makes sense to make maximum use out of that. I mean, we haven't even talked about the woos yet, but there's that too. And having three voices delivering that punch before the yeahs, it's another big exclamation mark in the song, and the more voices you can get to deliver that, the better. So yeah, I mean, it is incredible, but it makes a big difference having George's voice there.
So then, I'm assuming that people have written about this in lots of books, so it's not exactly the most hottest of takes. But of course, the groups that were doing those sorts of harmonies would be the Ronettes and the Crystals. And the like, so the American black girl groups, they would be doing that. And of course, as we know from previous podcasts, folks, if you've been listening for a while, big influence on the Beatles. Huh? Yeah.
Absolutely. But again, it was very much an American thing, and a lot of that influence came from black American girl groups. It just wasn't something that was part of the domestic market. So it's one of the things that all those songs that you were listing in the charts earlier on, they just don't sound like this. And you said a lot of the strength of this song was in the production. We have to talk about George Martin as well, because fuck me, this is a well-produced song.
Okay, why is it a well-produced song?
Partly because of the incredible limitations of technology. Obviously, we talk about this a few times, and that it's a lot with a little. But one of the great skills that George Martin has is that ability to have a kind of dynamism to the sonic landscape. That's such a pretentious way of putting it.
Yeah, it is. That's quite high on the pretentious scale. Yeah.
Yeah. Your pretentiousometer should be pinging at this stage, but that's what it is. There's so much depth to the way that he is able to produce the band, and he takes his time. There's nothing slapdash about this. I mentioned this when we were talking before about Do You Want to Know a Secret? But if you compare the Beatles version with the Billy J. Kramer version, it is a really telling comparison because both versions are produced by George Martin, and the Beatles version is 1,000% better produced, even though it's the same song. It's that kind of care and attention when he's really putting the work in, and you can see it, or hear it rather, across kind of the lines of George Martin's earlier works as well. The stuff that he did with Spike Milligan, the stuff that he did with Bernard Cribbins, all these records, it's kind of easy to be dismissive of them as kind of comedy records or novelty hits or that kind of stuff. But if you actually sit down and listen to them, not just as the songs, but if you listen to the production on them, if you listen to the way that George Martin is sort of constructing these soundscapes, he's using the... Oh God, here we go again. He's using the language of the recording studio to really give the songs what it is they need. And that kind of dynamism, that kind of approach is something which takes a huge amount of care and attention, and it's very easy to miss. So when we talk about this song having all this dynamism, all this energy, this life to it, this electricity that runs through it. I mean, obviously that's partly in the performance, but it really, really comes through in the production. And it's not a fussy production, it's not splashy or whatever, but what it does do is it captures the absolute essence, the absolute soul of the song, and presents it in the absolute best possible way that it can be presented. And that, particularly when we're talking at sort of this early stage, where there's not an awful lot more than a live performance and then maybe a couple of overdubs, that's an incredible skill for somebody like George Martin to be able to kind of bring to the surface. And I think with these early recordings, because they're not the technical sophistication of Walrus or Day in the Life or something like that, it kind of is easy to miss just how much effort is put into getting this song to sound the way it does.
I think it's interesting that people have been talking over the last couple of years about the attention span of the audience of modern day pop music, and how songs no longer have the lengthy kind of introductions that perhaps you would have found in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. You don't get successful pop singles with a 90-second introduction anymore. But this one just starts with a bang. It starts with the chorus and there's no let up. The song is bookended with the chorus, although slightly differently at the end. It sort of feels like it's kind of breaking and then summing everything up and pushing on. But there's in between, it's just relentless. And I think that's an important difference. Now, whether or not George Martin was involved in that, in terms of the way the song was actually constructed,
well, allegedly it was George Martin that told them to start it with the "She Loves You" and Ringo's drum firing. That was apparently his structural choice. He told them to do that. If the Standard Repository of All Knowledge and Wisdom Wikipedia is to be believed.
Okay, fair enough. Well, well done, George. Late review there. That's very good work.
I'm sure he'd be grateful to know that, were he still around to know that.
Oh, maybe I'll tell Giles. I'll find Giles on Twitter and say, your dad did good work there.
Yeah, he'll be surprised to hear his father spoken of in such glowing terms, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that I think, it's just a moment, and that's the thing about it. You don't, the word zeitgeist wouldn't have been used in 1963, but that's what this is. It's a zeitgeist moment.
Might have been used in Germany.
Well, I mean, as a general popular cultural descriptive in 1963, it wouldn't have been, people wouldn't have described it that way. But that's what it is. It's exactly the right song and exactly the right moment.
And I think that's why when The Guardian did their listing of the 100 greatest number one singles, the caveat to that is that they only allowed one per band. So it was effectively, for a band like the Beatles that had numerous number one singles, it was the one that they felt was the most culturally significant and represented them. They picked She Loves You. And you can see why. There are better songs. There's better production further down the line. Lyrically much more innovative than just the, hey, cliche bit here, gone for the third person, she loves you. Hey, variety. There's so many more that they could, the standard now would be Hey Jude, wasn't it? That's the one that seems to be the most highly thought of the Beatles singles. Fair enough, fantastic song. We'll get onto that in a few years' time, not a problem. But you can see why this was picked for its cultural impact. Now, if we were talking America, we'd probably go I Want to Hold Your Hand for reasons that we'll come on to in a few weeks' time. But this is just that moment of uniqueness, that moment of greatness, that moment of, F you, everybody else. We absolutely know how to do this, and you are going to follow in our wake.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I wouldn't have a different pick from that either. I can't think of any other Beatles songs which would have that sort of.
It's worth pointing out,
I suppose,
that She Loves You was in that top 100. It did only come third behind, I think, West End Girls by the Pet Shop Boys was number 1. I got a funny feeling Ghost Town by the Specials might have been number 2.
Well, those are both top-notch choices, so I'm not going to argue with either of those.
And also hugely culturally significant songs as well. But I will quietly try and Google it whilst you now say something interesting, so that my typing doesn't get caught on microphone.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm glad to see that we too are paying production notes and making sure that we don't fall into any obvious traps. I don't know how much more I have to add, other than to sort of say that if there was any one of those kind of early songs that I would have to pick as a favourite, then this would probably be top of the pile. Like I said, I don't have any kind of really revelatory takes on it. I don't really have anything which is going to sort of strip things bare and lead to a radical postmodernist reinterpretation of bloody bloody blah. I just really love it. I just think it's an astonishing song, and its power is not one that diminishes through over familiarity, and that in and of itself is an extraordinary achievement. I still love it, despite the hundreds of times I've probably listened to it over my lifetime. I don't ever feel the need to walk away from it from a while, and there's been other songs which I've loved to the very core of my being, Losing My Religion, for example, that I had to just stop listening to for a period of time because I just heard it enough. I've never had that with this song. I still love it now as much as I did pretty much the first time I heard it.
Well, two things. One, yes, it was Ghost Town by the Specials at number 2. And actually, really, really interesting. Again, such a hugely significant song at number 4, Donna Summer's I Feel Love. It's another song that changed everything. And the second point is, you missed my little hint earlier when you said Zeitgeist, and I referred to the fact that it probably is a word in German. That we could have gone with it. You've got nothing else to say about She Loves You? Well,
yeah, okay, she liebe dich.
Let's head to Germany.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, it's a good version. Yeah, I kind of like it in German. It's kind of cool. It says something that the song works just as well that way around. Yeah, it's great.
And it also means that not only is it one of the greatest A-sides of all time, it's also one of the greatest B-sides of all time, because I think, was it in Germany, it was released as the B-side to whatever the German is for I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, God, we should probably know that, right? Because we'll have to talk about it soon.
Yeah, well, it wasn't it got released as an A-side in America and scraped into the top 100. So, somewhere in America, probably in Minnesota, Beatles fans were buying She Loves You in German.
Good. I hope those Minnesotans are very happy with their purchase. They're probably worth a bloody fortune these days.
So I think that brief moment of silence there indicates that we have hit the end of the... Oh, look at me. I'm almost taking over hosting duties. Almost hit the end of the road here. And actually, I mean, what's interesting is that this now virtually takes us into 1964, doesn't it? Obviously, we've got the B-side to talk about, but once we get through that, and then we're starting to think about I Want to Hold Your Hand and what comes next, we're then hitting America and the Beatles and their enormous impact on American music.
Absolutely, and something very much to look forward to when we get to that. But I think for the time being, we can probably bring this one to a close. Fantastic. You can contact us by mail. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We are on Twitter at Beatles_ology, and you can find more of my writing at www.jgmacquarie.scot. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using so that more people can find the show. Next episode, we are going to be discussing the B-side to She Loves You, which means we are going to be talking about I'll Get You.
Briefly.
And of course, I'm going to guess that briefly is likely to be the running length of our next episode. But however long or however short we manage to go for, we hope you're going to join us for it. But until then, keep listening.